The white executioner had finally caught her. Elena Ashcombe didn't feel the cold anymore, and that was the sign that she was already dead. The rhythmic, bone-chilling crack of the moor ice beneath her was the only sound left in a world that had turned entirely white. It was a hollow, final noise, much like the thud of a gallows trapdoor. She felt her heart give one last, stuttering kick against her ribs, a frantic bird hitting the bars of a cage, and then it simply stopped. She collapsed, her face hitting the drift. She was no longer a woman, no longer a scandal. She was just a silhouette being erased by the frost. Then the world screamed. The sound of iron grinding against stone, the Duke's great gate, shattered the frozen silence. Through the tunnel of her fading consciousness, Elena felt a violent shift. The lethal, soul-crushing weight of the blizzard was suddenly replaced by a pair of crushing, leather-gloved arms. "Damn you, breathe!" The voice was a roar, raw and jagged with a strange, frantic desperation. The transition was a total sensory whiplash. 1 second, Elena was being claimed by the grave. The next, she was thrust into a world of suffocating, amber-lit heat. The Duke didn't call for a carriage. He didn't wait for a doctor. Breaking every rule of ducal decorum, Lucian Winterbourne kicked open the massive oak doors of his citadel himself, carrying the fallen socialite against his chest like a stolen prize. The air inside hit her like a physical blow. It was thick with the scent of burning cedar, expensive brandy, and the Duke's own heat. As he strode across the marble floors, his crimson mantle, lined with thick, regal ermine, draped over her like a heavy, blood-red shroud. "Your Grace," a housekeeper gasped, her voice trembling. "The scandal to bring her here in such a state." "To hell with the scandal," Lucian growled, his icy blue eyes fixed on Elena's blue-tinted lips. "I am the law in this house, and I say she lives." He didn't stop until he reached the hearth. He lowered her onto the fur rug, his hands, strong and trembling, immediately reaching for the frozen laces of her bodice. It was an act of absolute impropriety, a move that would ruin them both if seen, but as he leaned over her, his frantic breath warming her skin, the white executioner was forced to retreat. The Duke had broken the rules, and in doing so, he had snatched her back from the edge of the world. The heavy iron-bound doors of Winterbourne's citadel didn't just open. They succumbed to the Duke's boot with a crash that echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted stone entry. Lucian Winterbourne surged into the hall, a tempest of crimson velvet and freezing rage, carrying the limp, ethereal form of Elena Ashcombe. Snow swirled in behind them, a white ghost chasing its prey, but Lucian was faster. He ignored the line of servants who had gathered in the shadows, their faces pale masks of aristocratic horror. To them, Elena was a contagion, the woman whose name had been dragged through the gutters of every London broadsheet. To him, she was a weight of freezing silk and fadding pulses, her head lolling back against his shoulder in a way that made his own chest tighten with a savage, protective instinct. "Your Grace," the butler Halloway stammered, his eyes darting from the mud-stained hem of Elena's dress to the Duke's frantic, stubbled jawline. "The propriety, the scandal, she cannot be brought into the main wing. Perhaps the dower house or the—" "Silence," Lucian hissed. The word wasn't a command, it was a threat. He didn't slow his pace, his heavy boots thundering across the black and white marble floors. "The next person who speaks of propriety while a woman dies under my roof will find themselves on the other side of that door without a coat." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the rhythmic clink of the ruby-encrusted gold chain of office against Lucian's chest. He felt Elena's shallow, rattling breath against his neck, a feather-light touch of heat that was the only thing keeping him from descending into a total, mindless panic. He had spent years retreating from the world, building walls of ice and silence around his heart to keep his own demons at bay, but the sight of her collapsed in the snow had shattered his equilibrium. He didn't take her to a guest room, he didn't hand her over to a maid. He bypassed the formal receiving rooms and marched straight for his private chambers, a place where no woman had stepped in 5 years. With another kick, his bedroom doors swung open. The room was a fortress of dark mahogany and deep shadows, illuminated by a fire that roared with a primal ferocity. He crossed the threshold, his leather-gloved hands tightening their grip on her waist and knees. He could feel the lethal cold radiating from her skin, a blue tint creeping up her throat that whispered of the grave. "Move," he growled at the valet who stood by the hearth. As the servant scrambled away, Lucian lowered himself to the thick fur rug before the fire, but he did not let her go. He remained on one knee, cradling her against his warmth, his icy blue eyes scanning her face. She was deathly still, a single frozen tear glistening on her porcelain cheek like a diamond. In this moment, the Duke of Winterbourne was no longer a peer of the realm. He was a man committing a desperate trespass against the very social order he was born to uphold. He looked at the woman the world had called ruined and felt a surge of defiance so pure it tasted like iron. If the world wanted her dead, they would have to come through him. The doors to the Duke's inner sanctum slammed shut, sealing out the prying eyes of the household and the judgmental whispers of the hallway. Within the heavy mahogany walls, the only sound was the savage crackle of cedar logs and the ragged, desperate hitch of Lucian's own breath. He laid Alina upon the thick wolfskin rug before the hearth, the firelight dancing cruelly across her translucent skin. She looked less like a woman and more like an ice carving, delicate and moments away from shattering. "Halloway, the brandy," Lucian roared, not turning his head as the door creaked open just enough for a trembling hand to set a crystal decanter and a basin of warmed water on the low table. "Now leave us." He didn't wait for the click of the latch. Every second was a grain of sand slipping through a broken hourglass. Lucian's hands, usually steady enough to guide a horse through a hunt or sign away a fortune, shook as he reached for her. The grey wool of her dress was a tomb of frozen slush, siphoning away what little spark of life remained in her core. Propriety demanded he call for a lady's maid. Decorum dictated he should not even be in this room with her. Lucian stripped away his heavy leather gloves and cast them into the shadows. He reached for the silver-handled dagger at his belt, the blade glinting with an amber reflection. With the focused intensity of a man carving a path through an enemy line, he slid the steel beneath the frozen laces of her bodice. The fabric groaned and parted, revealing the terrifying pallor of her collarbone. The contrast was a physical blow to his senses. His hands, calloused and burning with the heat of the trek, moved against her skin, a collision of fire and frost. He began to rub her arms, his touch firm, almost frantic, trying to force the blood to remember its purpose. "Wake up, Alina," he commanded, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "I did not drag you from the moors just to watch you slip away on my rug." He reached for the decanter, pouring a measure of the dark, amber liquid into a glass. The scent of aged oak and burnt sugar filled the air. He propped her head against his brawny forearm, the weight of her damp, dark hair spilling over his brawny bicep like ink. With agonizing slowness, he pressed the rim of the glass to her blue-tinted lips. "Drink," he whispered. A few drops spilled, trailing like gold blood down her chin, but then her throat gave a microscopic, instinctive twitch. He set the glass aside and did the one thing that would forever seal their fates if the world ever found out. He discarded his heavy crimson mantle and his midnight blue tunic, down to his thin linen shirt, and pulled her shivering, broken form directly against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, enveloping her in the furnace of his own body heat, his heart thudding a heavy, rhythmic war drum against her spine. For a long, terrifying minute, there was nothing but the scent of wood smoke and the feel of her icy skin slowly, agonizingly drinking in his warmth. Lucian closed his eyes, his jaw tight, willing his own vitality into her. Then beneath his palms he felt it, a soft, stuttering vibration. A gasp, small and sharp as a needle, broke from her lips. Alina's body suddenly convulsed, a violent shiver racking her frame as the frost met the fire. She was coming back, and as her head fell back against his shoulder, her shallow breaths finally deepening, Lucian realized with a jolt of fierce, dark possessiveness that by saving her, he had tethered his soul to a woman the rest of the world had sworn to forget. The transition from the brink of death to the lap of luxury was not a gentle awakening. It was a sensory assault. When Alina's eyes finally flickered open, the world did not come into focus so much as it collided with her. The last thing she remembered was the abrasive, crystalline bite of the Yorkshire snow and the smell of wet earth. Now her senses were met with the overwhelming scent of beeswax, old parchment, and a lingering, masculine trace of cedarwood. She tried to move, and the first thing she felt was the sensory whiplash of the sheets. They were not the rough wool of her traveling cloak or the damp rags of her disgrace, but silk, heavy, cool, and impossibly smooth. The fabric glided over her skin with a fluid intimacy that made her gasp, the sensation a jarring contrast to the memory of the freezing mud that had almost been her shroud. The warmth of the room was stifling, a thick, golden heat that pulsed from a massive fireplace she could hear crackling somewhere to her right. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her vision cleared, revealing a ceiling of dark, intricately carved oak beams and a canopy of midnight blue velvet that towered over her like a monument. This was not a room for a fallen woman, it was a fortress for a king. A sudden movement in the shadows near the hearth made her breath hitch. "You're awake." The voice was deep, vibrating through the floorboards and into the very mattress beneath her. Elena turned her head slowly, her neck feeling stiff and fragile as a glass rod. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair was the silhouette of a man. He had discarded his heavy mantle and tunic. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked powerful enough to crush stone. His hair was a dark, windswept mess, and his jaw was shadowed by a heavy growth of stubble that spoke of a night spent in vigil. Lucian Winterbourne didn't stand. He watched her with eyes the color of a frozen lake, piercing and uncomfortably intense. Where am I?" Elena's voice was a ghost of itself, a dry rasp that hurt her throat. She tried to sit up, but the silk sheets shifted, and she realized with a jolt of pure, icy terror that she was no longer wearing her frayed wool dress. She was clad in a man's nightshirt of fine, translucent lawn, the oversized sleeves swallowing her hands. "You are at Winterbourne," the Duke replied, his voice devoid of the judgment she had come to expect from every man in England. "And you are alive, though by a very narrow margin." Elena pulled the covers up to her chin, her knuckles white. The memories of London began to flood back, the whispers in the ballroom, the cold turning of backs, the way her own father had looked at her as if she were a stain on the family crest. She was the ghost of Mayfair, a woman whose reputation had been executed in the public square. "You shouldn't have brought me here," she whispered, her eyes brimming with a sudden hot moisture. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what they say?" Lucian finally rose, his towering frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the bed. He stepped into the light of the fire, the gold filigree of his signet ring glinting. He didn't look like a man concerned with the ton or their poisonous gossip. He looked like a man who had declared war on the world long ago. "I know that the storm didn't care about your reputation," he said, stepping closer until he stood at the edge of the bed. "And neither do I in this house, Miss Ashcombe. The only rules that matter are mine. And my first rule is that you will eat, you will sleep, and you will stop looking at me as if I am about to cast you back into the snow." The sheer audacity of his presence, the warmth of the room, and the terrifying softness of the bed beneath her made Elena's head spin. She had expected a convent, a workhouse, or a grave. Instead, she had been claimed by the beast of Winterbourne. As he reached out to adjust the heavy velvet curtain, his hand brushed against the silk near her shoulder. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder that while the frost had left her body, a new, much more dangerous kind of fire was just beginning to burn. The storm outside had transitioned from a scream to a low, rhythmic thrumming against the stone walls of the citadel, a sound that underscored the heavy silence in the Duke's private library. Elena sat swaddled in a robe of heavy claret silk that clearly belonged to Lucian, the hem pooled around her feet like spilled wine. The warmth of the room was intoxicating. Yet she felt a different kind of chill, the kind that came from being truly seen by a man who had no reason to be kind. Across from her, Lucian sat near a low-burning fire, a decanter of amber liquid between them. The firelight played across the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face, catching the silver blue of his eyes. He had been silent for an hour, watching the snow pile against the leaded glass panes until the quiet became a weight of its own. "You look at me with such bracing expectation, Miss Ashcombe," he said, his voice cutting through the gloom like a blade. "You are waiting for the lecture, for the moment I tell you that while I saved your life, I cannot possibly be seen with you. You are waiting for the polite rejection." Elena tightened her grip on the arms of her chair. "It is the way of the world, your grace. I'm a woman whose name is spoken in whispers behind fans. You have a reputation to protect." Lucian let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Without a word, he set his glass down and began to unbutton the cuff of his left sleeve. He rolled the linen back with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a jagged, puckered trail of scar tissue that spiraled up his forearm and disappeared beneath his shirt. It was an ugly, violent mark, at odds with the gold filigree and velvet of his station. "I earned this not in a duel of honor, but in a gutter in Naples, fighting off men sent by my own blood to ensure I never return to claim this title," he said, his gaze fixed on the scar. "And these," he gestured vaguely to the shadows of his own face, "are the scars society cannot see. I was the mad heir before I was the Beast of Winterbourne. I have been slandered, hunted, and betrayed by the very people who now bow the lowest when I enter a room." He leaned forward, the firelight illuminating the raw intensity in his expression. "The polite world you are so worried about is a theater of vipers, Elena. They celebrate the shine of the crown while they sharpen the knife for the throat. I did not retreat to these moors because I hate people. I retreated because I find more honor in the company of the disgraced than in the company of the virtuous." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. For months, she had felt like a monster, a creature of shame that had to be hidden away. But as she looked at Lucian, she saw a man who had taken his own brokenness and turned it into a fortress. "They say you are dangerous," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am," he admitted, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering heat. "I am dangerous to anyone who thinks they can dictate who is worthy of life and who is not. I prefer the outcasts, Miss Ashcombe, because they are the only ones who know the value of the light. They are the only ones who are real." He stood then, crossing the small space between them until he was looming over her chair. He didn't touch her, but the proximity of his heat was a physical pressure. "You think you are a ghost, a ruin, but to me, you are the first living thing to cross this threshold in 5 years. Do not apologize for surviving the fire. Wear your scars as I wear mine, as proof that the world couldn't break you." In the flickering shadows of his sanctuary, Elena felt the first true thaw in her chest. The shame that had been a leaden weight for months didn't disappear, but it shifted. She wasn't just a fallen woman in a duke's house. She was a survivor in the company of a king who had built a throne out of his own exile. The sanctuary of the library was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the moors, the frantic, rhythmic pounding of a brass knocker against the outer oak. It was a formal sound, a cold sound, and it instantly severed the fragile thread of understanding that had pulled Elena and Lucian together. Elena stiffened, her hand flying to the throat of the claret silk robe, as if she could hide the fact of her existence behind the heavy fabric. Minutes later, Holloway appeared in the doorway, his silver tray trembling. Upon it sat a single envelope, sealed with a crest of black wax that Elena recognized with a jolt of nauseating terror. It was the seal of the Chancery, the cold arm of the law that enforced the social mandates of the Crown. "A messenger from London, Your Grace," Holloway whispered, his voice thick with unease. "He rode through the drifts at great cost. He says it is a matter of public decency and official record." Lucian didn't look at the butler. His eyes remained fixed on Elena's face, watching the color drain from her lips until they matched the porcelain tint of the day he had found her. He reached out and snapped the letter from the tray with a flick of his wrist. He didn't wait for the butler to depart before he broke the seal, the black wax crumbling like coal dust onto the rug. Elena watched his eyes track the lines of elegant, looping script, the kind of script that destroyed lives with beautiful penmanship. As he read, the Duke's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping in his cheek. His icy blue eyes darkened to the color of a winter sea before a storm. "It is a decree of civilian banishment," Lucian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating register. "It states that Miss Elena Ashcombe is officially stripped of her standing. Her assets are frozen. She is forbidden from entering the City of London or the county of her birth under penalty of vagrancy laws. It suggests, no, it commands that any peer of the realm sheltering her should surrender her to the parish authorities for correction." A sob caught in Elena's throat. The parish authorities, they mean the workhouse. They want to finish what the scandal started. They want to bury me where no one can hear me scream. She stood on shaking legs, the silk robe trailing behind her. You must let them take me, Lucian. If you keep me here now, it isn't just a scandal. It's a crime against the crown. They will take your title. They will use your mad heir reputation to strip you of everything. Lucian looked down at the paper in his hand, the official word of the world that deemed her a contagion. Then he looked at her. He saw the single trail of blood still faintly marked on her cheek, the firelight catching the gold in her dark hair, and the fierce, flickering life in her eyes that even the blizzard hadn't been able to extinguish. The crown didn't save you from the snow, Lucian growled. The law didn't pull you from the ice. In one swift, violent motion, he turned to the hearth. He held the letter over the center of the flames. For a heartbeat, the paper curled, the black ink of her banishment glowing orange before catching fire. The flames licked upward, turning the decree into a jagged piece of blackened lace. Lucian didn't let go until the heat singed his fingertips, dropping the ash into the glowing embers where it disappeared into nothingness. "There is no letter," Lucian said, turning back to her, his silhouette framed by the fire he had just fed with her disgrace. "There is no decree. There is only this house, and the fact that I am the Duke of Winterbourne. If the world wants to take you, they will have to march through 10 feet of snow and 1,000 years of my family's blood to reach my door." He stepped toward her, his presence an absolute, immovable force. "You are not a ward of the state, Elena. You are a guest of the beast, and I have never been particularly good at following the rules." The smell of burnt paper and cedarwood hung heavy in the air, the scent of a bridge being burned. Elena realized then that the sanctuary was no longer just a place of recovery. It was a fortress under siege, and the man standing before her had just declared war on the world for her sake. The days that followed were a blur of golden lamplight and the rhythmic ticking of the library's grandfather clock, as the world outside remained a white, impenetrable void. Within the Duke's private library, a hidden kingdom of leather-bound secrets and towering oak shelves, Elena Ashcombe began to reclaim her body from the frost. But this was a scandalous recovery, conducted in the deep, flickering shadows of a man's most intimate retreat. She was no longer the porcelain doll shattered in the snow, yet she was not quite the woman she had been in London. She moved through the room in a state of soft-focused domesticity that would have sent the dowagers of Mayfair into a collective swoon. Clad in the Duke's own silk robes and a pair of his finest wool stockings to protect her healing feet, she practiced her first steps between the velvet armchair and the sprawling mahogany desk. Lucian was always there, a silent, watchful guardian. He did not call for the governess or a nurse to assist her. He offered his own arm, a solid, unyielding branch of muscle and warm linen. Again, he would murmur, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady her more than his grip. Elena took a tentative step, the silk of the robe whispering against the Persian rug. The sensory whiplash of her new life had not faded, it had merely deepened. She was surrounded by the artifacts of a powerful man's mind, maps of forbidden lands, ancient texts on alchemy, and the lingering scent of his tobacco and cedarwood. It was a kingdom of two, a place where her disgrace was not a shroud, but a secret shared. As she reached the center of the room, her knees gave a traitorous wobble. Before she could gasp, Lucian was behind her, his hands catching her by the waist. The contact was electric, a sudden surge of heat that made the breath hitch in her throat. For a long, breathless moment, he did not pull away. His chest was a broad, steady wall against her back, and she could feel the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart through his shirt. "You are pushing yourself too hard, Elena," he whispered, his breath stirring the dark hair at her temple. "I have to be strong," she replied, her voice trembling not from weakness, but from the terrifying proximity of him. "If the world comes to your gate again, I cannot be found hiding under a silk shroud. I will not be the reason you lose your crown." Lucian turned her slowly in his arms, his hands sliding upward to rest just below her ribs. In the dim, candlelit glow of the library, his icy blue eyes were no longer cold. They were burning with a dark, predatory protectiveness. "Let the world come," he growled. "Let them see that the fallen socialite walks with the grace of a queen in the beast's garden. They think they broke you, but they only stripped away the lies. What is left is far more dangerous." He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint, fadding line of the ice cut on her cheek. It was a gesture of such profound, rule-breaking intimacy that Elena felt the last of her social defenses crumble. In this hidden kingdom, She wasn't Miss Ashcombe, the scandal of the year. She was a woman being worshipped by a man who had burned her banishment in the fire. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his collarbone. The library, with its walls of books and its scent of sanctuary, felt like the only real place left in the universe. Outside, the storm might be clearing, and with the clear skies would come the hunters and the law. But here, in the amber light of their shared exile, Elena was learning to walk again, not as a victim, but as a woman who had found her throne in the heart of a monster. The peace of the hidden kingdom was not broken by a shout, but by a silence that felt far more ominous. The blizzard had finally exhausted its fury, leaving the moors a blinding, pristine white that reflected the morning sun with a cruel clarity. Inside the library, the amber warmth felt suddenly fragile, as if the retreating clouds had stripped away the citadel's primary defense. Lucian was standing by the tall, leaded windows, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He had been staring toward the distant, smoking chimneys of the village for nearly an hour when Holloway entered. The butler did not carry a tray this time. He carried a look of grim, suppressed urgency. "Speak," Lucian commanded, his voice like grinding stone. "The snow is packed enough for a carriage, Your Grace," Holloway whispered, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elena, who sat by the fire. "A black coach arrived at the village in an hour ago. No crest on the door, but the driver is wearing London livery. A man was seen stepping out, a Lord Stirling." The name hit Elena like a physical blow. The silk robe she wore suddenly felt like a target rather than a sanctuary. Lord Julian Stirling. He was the architect of her ruin, the man whose silver-tongued lies had turned her father against her and made her a pariah in the eyes of the law. He wasn't just a shadow of her past. He was the hunter who had come to ensure the kill was complete. "Stirling," Lucian repeated, the name curling in his mouth like poison. He turned away from the window, his expression unreadable, though his icy blue eyes had hardened into chips of flint. "He is bold to come so far north. He must be desperate to see his handiwork buried in the snow." Elena rose, her legs trembling with a weakness that had nothing to do with her recovery. "He won't stop at the village, Lucian. He's here to finish it. He'll have papers, or a bribe for the local magistrate, or the backing of the Chancery. If he finds me here, he will use your protection of me to destroy you. He'll say you abducted a disgraced ward of the state. He'll call it a crime of passion, a beast preying on a fallen girl." She moved toward him, her hands reaching out as if to push him away from her own misfortune. "You have to let me go. I can slip out through the servants' passage. I can make it to the coast." "You will make it nowhere," Lucian interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped toward her, his presence instantly filling the space between them. He took her hands in his grip firm and hot, anchoring her to the spot. "The safe haven is compromised, Elena, but the walls are still standing. Stirling thinks he is coming to claim a victim. He has forgotten that he is entering the territory of a man who has nothing left to lose but the woman he saved." He looked toward Holloway, his gaze sharp and decisive. "Double the watch at the great gate. If Lord Stirling attempts to cross my land, he is to be met with steel, not hospitality. And Holloway, fetch my heavy coat. I believe it is time the village saw that the Duke of Winterbourne is no longer in retreat." The sensory whiplash of the moment was profound. The intimacy of their candlelit library had been replaced by the cold, sharp reality of war. Elena looked into Lucian's eyes and saw no fear, only a savage, dark joy at the prospect of the coming confrontation. The shadow at the gate was no longer a ghost of her past. He was a catalyst. Stirling had come to drag her back into the dark, but as Lucian's fingers tightened around hers, Elena realized that the beast was not merely her protector, he was her champion. The hidden kingdom was no longer a secret, it was a fortress, and the battle for her soul was about to move from the shadows of the library to the blood-stained snow of the moors. The air in the great hall was as sharp as a whetstone. Outside, the sound of horse hooves crunching through the frozen crust of the snow signaled that Lord Stirling had reached the courtyard. Inside, the flickering firelight played across the Duke's heavy, ruby-encrusted gold chain of office, the literal and metaphorical weight of 1,000 years of Winterbourne history. Lucian stood in the center of the hall, his crimson mantle draped over his shoulders, looking every bit the formidable sovereign of the north. But as the iron knocker struck the door with a demanding, rhythmic arrogance, Lucian didn't look toward the entrance. He looked at Alina. She stood by the shadows of the staircase, her fingers twisted in the silk of the robe he had given her, her eyes wide with the terror of a woman who expected to be traded for peace. "He is here for me, Lucian," she whispered, her voice cracking the silence. "He has the law in his pocket. If you stand against him as a duke, they will strip you of this house. They will take your name. You cannot break the law for a ghost." Lucian didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached for his throat. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unhooked the heavy gold chain of office. The links clinked with a sound that felt like a funeral bell for his status. He draped the rubies and gold over a side table as if they were nothing more than common iron. Then, his hand went to his finger. He twisted off the heavy, ruby-encrusted signet ring, the seal that could authorize executions, grant lands, and command the respect of the Queen herself. He walked toward her, his boots echoing with a finality that made the servants gasp in the shadows. He took Alina's trembling hand and pressed the cold, heavy gold of the signet ring into her palm. "What are you doing?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is your legacy. This is your protection." "This is a shackle, Alina," Lucian said, his icy blue eyes burning with a clarity she had never seen before. "For years, I have lived behind these walls, a prisoner of my own title and the rules that came with it. I thought the beast was my curse, but it was my armor, and I am done wearing it for a society that demands I sacrifice a life for a lie." He closed her fingers over the ring, his large hands enveloping hers. The sensory whiplash was no longer about the cold or the silk. It was the raw, terrifying heat of his conviction. "If being a duke means I must hand you over to a man like Sterling, then I am no duke," he growled, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that shook the very air between them. "I would rather be a commoner on the edge of the world with you than a king in a palace built on your blood. Let him come with his warrants. Let him come with his laws. He is meeting a man today, not a title, and a man protects what is his." The doors burst open. The freezing air of the moors rushed in, bringing with it the scent of salt and malice as Lord Sterling stepped into the hall, a legal parchment held like a weapon in his hand. But Lucian didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the intruder. He leaned down, his forehead resting against Alina for a fleeting, rule-breaking second. "Keep the ring," he whispered. "It's just gold. You are the only thing in this house that has a soul." He turned then, his shoulders broad and his stance predatory, facing the entrance. He stood before Alina not as the Duke of Winterbourne, but as her shield. The chain of office lay forgotten in the shadows, a discarded relic of a world that no longer had any power over him. The battle wasn't just for her freedom anymore, it was for the new life they had forged in the frost, a life that was worth more than 1,000 crowns. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world of blinding white silence that pressed against the tall windows of the great hall. Lord Sterling stood in the center of the marble floor, his black traveling coat dripping slush onto the pristine stone. He held the legal warrant aloft like a holy relic, his face twisted into a smirk of practiced cruelty. Behind him stood 2 village constables, their faces etched with the deep unease of men caught between the letter of the law and the terrifying presence of the man they had feared since childhood. "You are harboring a fugitive from social justice, Winterbourne," Sterling announced, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling. "The Chancery has spoken. Alina Ashcombe is a ward of the state, a woman of ruined character whose very presence is a blight upon this county. Step aside, or you will find yourself in a cell beside her." Lucian didn't step aside. He stood with his feet braced, a man stripped of his chain of office, but radiating a power that made the heavy gold links on the table look like children's toys. The sensory whiplash of the moment was absolute. The freezing air from the open doors met the roaring heat of the hearth, creating a mist that swirled around his legs like the spirits of the moor. "You speak of ruin," Lucian said, his voice a low, predatory growl that made the constables retreat a step. "But the only ruin I see in this hall is the man who rode through a blizzard to hunt a woman who had already lost everything. You didn't come for justice, Sterling. You came to ensure she died in the drifts so your secrets would stay buried." Sterling's smirk faltered. The law. The law ends at my gate, Lucian interrupted, his hand moving to the hilt of the hunting knife at his belt, and my protection begins at my heart. He turned slightly, extending his hand toward the shadows of the grand staircase. Elena, come forward. Elena emerged from the darkness, and the hall fell into a silence so profound it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. She was no longer the fallen socialite matted with snow and blood. She wore a gown of deep midnight velvet, a relic from the Winterbourne archives, and the ruby-encrusted signet ring glittered on her finger, far too large, but held with a steady, defiant hand. She walked with the grace of a woman who had been through the fire and found herself forged of steel. She stepped to Lucian's side, and he did the one thing that broke the final, unspoken rule of the British Empire. He did not shield her as a servant or hide her as a mistress. He reached out and laced his fingers through hers, pulling her hand up to press a lingering, public kiss to her knuckles in front of every witness in the room. Lord Stirling, Lucian said, his eyes locking onto his enemy with a lethal, icy clarity, you have been misinformed. You are not here to arrest a ward of the Chancery. You are standing in the presence of the future Duchess of Winterbourne. The gasp that went up from the servants was a collective shiver. Stirling's face turned a mottled, ugly purple. You cannot, a duke cannot marry a woman of her standing, the Queen herself. The Queen is a woman who married for love, and I suspect she would recognize a soulmate when she sees one, Lucian countered, stepping forward until he was inches from Stirling's face. As for her standing, she stands at my side. That makes her the highest-ranking woman in Yorkshire. Now take your warrant and your lies and get off my land before I decide that civilian banishment is a policy I should apply to you personally, with my boot. Stirling looked from the Duke's savage expression to Elena's cold, unwavering gaze. He saw the signet ring, the mark of the Winterbourne sovereign, and realized the beast had not been tamed, he had been unleashed. Without another word, Stirling turned and fled into the cold, his boots clicking a frantic retreat across the marble. As the heavy doors slammed shut for the final time, the great hall returned to its amber glow. Elena looked up at Lucian, her eyes bright with tears that were no longer shed in shame. The winter throne wasn't made of gold or velvet. It was the quiet, unbreakable bond between two outcasts who had found home in the middle of a storm. You broke every rule, she whispered, her voice finally steady. No, Lucian said, pulling her into the furnace heat of his embrace. I just realized that the rules were never meant for us. Outside, the sun finally crested over the moors, turning the snow to a field of diamonds. The disgrace was gone, buried under the drifts, and in its place was a kingdom built on the ruins of the world they had left behind.